12, 12 step. I mean, it was kind of like a Bible version of 12-step groups. So uh, it, there wasn't a lot of services in Alaska that had to do specifically with anti-gay therapy because, I mean, I was living in Anchorage. There's not a lot of people out there, but there's some people that I actually went to about five different groups that offered forms of counseling, but none of them specifically deal with gay issues. So by the end of 2004, I was getting phone counseling from an organization called Caruso Ministries that at that time was run by a guy you might have heard of named Michael Johnston.
Uh-huh.
And and that's a funny part of the story. Can I tell you a little tidbit about that?
Sure.
Because Johnston was from Anchorage, and if you know anything about his story, he got HIV positive in the mid '80s, and then he went through anti-gay therapy stuff, and then by the '90s he had his own coast to coast parachurch group that had an office in um, both sides of the U.S. And so I was getting phone counseling from them. Meanwhile, around that same year, around the early 2000s, um, Michael Johnston was basically barebacking a guy and not telling him his HIV status.
Uh,
And one of his hookups recognized him and thought, "Oh my God, I got fucked by Michael Johnston," and he's supposed to be one of the biggest spokespersons for anti-gay type, conversion therapy stuff. And not only that, he's open about his HIV status, and so that was another controversy that led him to go into, guess where? Pure Life Ministries. So I ended up bumping into him in Kentucky when I went down there in '05. So there's a lot of funny things about that too. So
okay.
but
Well,
flashback
okay.
to 2001, I
Yeah.
started with this group called Celebrate Recovery, and then I went to another organization that did this sort of pseudo spiritual healing stuff with counseling and prayer. I went to another organization that was supposed to be like a healing ministry. And then, of course, I went to, my church. And of course, the pastor has all the answers, pray and read your Bible. And then I was in and out of this Celebrate Recovery group. And then there was an offshoot of that, which was basically like as unbelievably abusive and unfair the Celebrate Recovery group was. The the guy that was in charge of the sexual addiction group, which is of course they put me in because they think that any form of homosexuality is a form of sexual addiction, that
Uh-huh.
I was put into that category, and he had his own thing going on which was unbelievably abusive. And that was you know about 3 or 4 years of going in and out of those groups because I would be so devastated, and then I didn't have anywhere else to go. um, my life did not provide me any options but one.
Um,
So after several months of going back and forth, I finally started dating men in 2004 at the age of 30, and I had about eight different guys I hooked up with that year. And finally, in March of 2005, I sold my business. I went down to that residential program in Kentucky, and
uh-huh.
I would have never guessed that things would get even more abusive. So basically, each group that I went to, with the three main groups, um, the cruelty and the trauma that they inflicted on me was multiplied each time, to where I was brought to emotional and financial ruin, and I was very threatened that I would have even been brought to even worse financial and emotional ruin if I would have left the program prematurely because of the tactics that they use. And they were extremely cult-like. And so I recommend you look up an organization called Pure Life Ministries, because I checked earlier this week, and there's only one article that comes up that is negative about them. You have to go through several pages of Google searches in order to find anything else negative about them.
Can you elaborate on, and I don't want you to share any details that you don't feel comfortable sharing.
Oh, I'm comfortable with sharing everything. I'm very public about this. Yeah.
In terms of, you mentioned this cruelty, what sort of things did you endure?
Two of the programs that I was involved in would include groups where men could basically give their feedback. If they think you're lying, they say, that you're lying and you need to repent and whatever. And it's very humiliating, some of the tactics that they would use. The residential program was even worse because they would have one of the tactics they would use if they wanted to break somebody, and it was all about breaking them. And so they would find different forms of psychological harm, whether it was punishing them, humiliating them in front of their peers, even walking into a room. One of the so-called counselors would come in and he would just start pointing to people and insulting them and criticizing them, mostly for no reason at all, just because they might have been doing or saying something that he thought was something they needed to change, or not even that. It was basically bullying in order to tear somebody's ego down so they would just be in a state of total submission. And they just assumed that when somebody was completely unable to have their own will, their own thoughts, that's where they thought that their healing would start. And so I would be humiliated in front of a crowd because one of the leaders thought I was doing something, dishonest, and there was nothing I could do about it, because the more I tried to speak up for myself, I would endure more punishment. Some of the punishment would be where you had to wake up early on a Saturday morning and do hard labor, or labor that wasn't quite as hard. But for me, trying to work a full-time job and surviving this program, I was already broken down to the point when, for instance, some of the other tactics they would use was sleep deprivation.
Okay. This is in Kentucky that you're talking about, right?
Yeah, that was the residential program, because there's not a lot I couldn't call it an outpatient, but the recovery type programs that I was in Alaska, they used a lot of the same tactics, power control, intimidation, outnumbering, things that resemble bullying and all those things. They could only do so much in a small group setting, but it was a lot different in a residential place where they would, they would threaten to demote you in the program, or have you start the program over again, or add more months to your program. And I decided I was going to stick with it and graduate. So I stuck with the entire 6 months, and then they extended me another month because I had confessed I had a crush on somebody at work or something like that. It's okay, we're going to give you an extra month. They knew that was going to undermine my career back in Alaska. But the counselor I was working with wasn't really concerned that I was going to get my teaching business back, because he was trying to get me to not even go back to Alaska. So there was really no concern about what was going to happen after I graduated. They didn't really have any follow-up. They wanted an awful lot of control, though.
Okay. Well, how did you eventually, you say you graduated the program. What did you do
That was
at
early.
that point?
That was early October of 2005, and through a connection in Alaska, I had met up with a a so-called minister. He was basically a real estate con artist. He was involved in small businesses and real estate scams and things like that. And he was fooling people in Alaska and fooling people in different places. And I was very vulnerable, and he gave me an opportunity to help his church. So I flew out to North Carolina. I had a one-way ticket out there. Meanwhile, my counselor with the program didn't look into any of this, and I had my reservations about it, but he insisted that I take this opportunity because he said that only sin was waiting for me in Alaska. But I lasted 9 days with this con artist and nearly wasted all my money before I realized that I had to get out of there. And I moved back to Kentucky, and I spent another 5 months continuing to work in factories and warehouses and other temp jobs. The last job that I had, that I really had no choice, I had no car, and I was living in this single occupancy building with some other graduates from the program who were trying to survive. And I was working night shifts, sometimes 12 hours through the night, doing factory work. And for somebody like me, who was a creative-minded person, a recent trauma survivor, past trauma survivor, and somebody who was living with an undiagnosed and untreated mental illness, I ended up going through extreme burnout, and then through that time, giving up on my on this whole ex-gay thing for a while, decided I was going to go on a phone dating service, and I was really lucky. I happened the only guy I met on the phone dating service was a man that I ended up in a 2-year relationship with.
Uh-huh.
And he rescued me from a suicide attempt one time, and that was in March of 2006. So I survived a suicide attempt. It wasn't a very effective suicide attempt, but it's the only time I'd ever done anything close to that in my whole life.
And how long after your graduation was that?
And then that was 5 months after my graduation.
All right.
And Pure Life Ministries was supposedly doing some follow-up work with me, but they didn't include me in much of what they were doing. In fact, they were favoring a lot of other men who had characteristics that I didn't have, and for me, I just felt very banished from that world most of the time. Oh, hang on just a second. Hey, Clark, I'm in a phone meeting right now. Can you hang on a bit? Yep. Okay. Yep, the contractor is here. So I'll go for another couple minutes, and then maybe if you have any more questions, you can follow up with me about that, because I'd like to share more of my story. It's pretty extensive.
Okay, so how did you end up ultimately walking away from this and deciding that you weren't going to live by these rules?
Well, I ended up trying to move in with that man, and he had some. He definitely had a lot of issues as well, but we'd get into fights, and he'd say, "Hey, we're not hurting anybody. What we're doing," and I said, "It's wrong," and I said, This is just a phase I'm going through. I'm eventually going to marry a woman and have a family." That was my mentality. I was a registered Republican. I was very much in the conservative world, and I wasn't ready to dive, head first into the gay community, because having grown up in that and seeing that it wasn't a safe place for somebody like me, and honestly, it still isn't, unfortunately, just because of a general attitude against mental illness. And so I really didn't have anywhere to go. And then we loved each other. And so I was really having a dilemma. So I flew back to Alaska, and he followed me out there a couple weeks later. And then we decided we were going to be partners. And he said he wanted to, you know, have me send all my stuff that I had in storage in Alaska back to Kentucky, and I was going to move in with him in his little suburban home. And I decided, well, I really need to come out, and so I started attending a metropolitan community church. A couple of them. I didn't last, I would only last at an MCC church for 2 or 3 months, and then I would just go, yeah, and it's not my culture. I've never really identified much with that kind of culture. Like I was saying about the liberal type churches, the liturgical type churches that I grew up in, like that were more intellectual and things like that. And then, so basically, I came out of the closet. It was Memorial Day of 2006, so that was around May 28th. And then 10 years later, I symbolically went back into the closet. But publicly, I'm publicly closeted. Have you ever heard anybody that identifies that way?
No. What that mean?
Oh,
okay.
I will have to tell you later because nobody ever asked me. So I have to remember what I was going to tell people when they ask me, because they usually get so offended if I make a statement like that. They don't realize how fun it is to identify with being publicly closeted. And but the good news is I just started another relationship last week, and it was kind of a surprise. It kind of snuck up on me. This first partner I was telling you about out in Kentucky, he died of pancreatic cancer a year ago. We remained friends for 10 years after we broke up, and I just, there's so many stories I could go on, Jacob, but I have to go talk to a housing contractor and take care of some business. But let me send you some media over Messenger, or if you'd want to continue this stuff over email, you can shoot me an email address, or I can give that to you.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much, Spangler. Thank you.
Hey, you betcha. And The Advocate is awesome. I mean, I never read magazines because I don't read very well, but I'm very familiar with what you guys do. And I'm really glad you contacted me. I really appreciate that.
Well, hey, thank you. Thank you for
your time. Okay, we will definitely keep in touch about all this stuff. Okay, sounds good, Jacob. Okay. Alrighty, bye-bye now. Oh, crazy day today. How about you?
Every day is a crazy day.
Yeah, nice. Hey, first off, I really appreciate you getting with me. I hope you understand why I get so anxious about this stuff.
No, I totally understand. I really do.
Oh, that's good. It's been a weird ride, and I just, as I wasn't sure if the plan you had originally for featuring my story, which is going to be in the middle of a bunch of other stories of similar conversion therapy folks?
Well, it's part of a series, and the series are being released individually. Okay. So, yes, it's part of a run. I mean, ideally we want like 35. We're probably going to have about half that when it really gets down to it. But we've already started running several of the pieces.
Cool.
And we've got yours on the way. And I can send you links if you want to get a feel for what they look like.
Yeah. Now, is this going to be for the online magazine only, or for the printed magazine?
I do not know what they're going to do in print. I know we've been collecting this stuff. I believe they have a plan to do something in print, but probably not going to be the full-length stories.
Yeah,
that'll be available online in full. So.
Well, that would be really hard to do, because some of us have stories. Like mine was originally a 40,000 word piece, and that was just from a 6 month period of my ex-gay story, and mine was 5 years. And from my perspective, though, I honestly think that the most important part of my story is what happened after straight camp, and that's the stuff that people don't even consider. And most of the time, when I hear people coming out of conversion therapy, it typically ends in a success story of, they got involved in a welcoming community or church, or they got their life back, they got their career back, especially if they were doing church ministry. They just sort of convert their Baptist degree to a United Church of Christ or Unitarian, and basically they end up with the same position of influence. They end up with a similar career, and they have some trauma to heal from. And a lot of times, these folks do get help with their trauma. The stories we don't hear are the ones that I talk to. The ones that I talk to, especially the ones that came out of the program that I was involved in. We're talking trauma-induced mental illness that has made them unable to get back to work and have relationships. The other thing is hard drugs, cocaine, meth, and heroin in particular. Really, the only part of my success is the fact that, one, I haven't killed myself, although I tried to after I got out of straight camp, and the fact that I never got hooked on hard drugs. I admit I'm a cannabis user. It's pretty much every night, sometimes during the day for me. And a lot of folks that have dealt with severe trauma take different forms of cannabis, or, they like to call it marijuana, which is luckily legal in the Pacific Northwest, So anyways, based on the information that you had, did you feel like the stuff that I sent you and what we talked about was sufficient for the article, or would it be okay to add some things to it?
Well, it's important to add what happened afterwards, and, I'm all for that. So, have you actually dealt with a lot of people in any sort of professional capacity, or are these just people who went through the camp with you?
The people that I know from straight camp, they are either still in anti-gay type of communities and believing in that myth, and they don't want to engage with me for obvious reasons. And then you've got some who are sort of on the fence, where they feel like there's one particular young man who went to the same camp that I went to, and his attitude was, okay, he's gay, but it's a sin and he's going to hell for it. And so he has to live with that type of double life. And then I told you about the drugs and stuff too. So there's another guy that went through my program, and he had an undiagnosed and untreated mental illness like I did. They told him to get off of his medications. I had not been on psych meds when I was in that program, but they knew full well about my disorders and how much I suffered, and they did not at all point me in the direction of getting a legitimate mental health. The issue I had with this other young man, who I won't mention, I talked to him years ago, and I just got the feeling that his facts were really distorted. And so I'm thinking maybe that's one of the reasons why folks that live with a debilitating mental illness often aren't heard, because there's so many that aren't good communicators and that end up, not showing facts that seem reasonable, or for whatever reason, they just can't communicate, because I've noticed that stories like mine are they're a lot more typical than what I see in the media as far as ex-gay survivors.
Okay. And so you had a hard break with the church, with religion in general. I know that. I just was looking over your notes, right?
Yeah. My story, though, is a little different, because I was an adult convert. I was the only born-again Bible Christian in my entire family. So the weird thing about my thing is the fact that they didn't disown me, though, but I was excommunicated, not by everyone, but I did experience that because of my faith, and because of trying to be ex-gay and identifying as ex-gay. But when I came out of the closet, suddenly my family's like, hey, it's nice to have you back, and all this stuff. So it was a little different than most people's families. When we have Christmas and family reunions, I would estimate 20 to 30% of us are, somehow gay, bi, or queer, or closeted. It's a gay family we have. Here's what I don't like about coming from a gay family is that there are myths about ex-gay survivors. And one of the myths, and I really want you to understand this, is that when somebody comes out of a straight camp, they contact a gay community center, a gay hotline, or organizations that specialize in ex-gay survivors, and they get help. That is a myth. And I told that to one of my family members, and I got this email, and this was ironic. I got an email of 3, anti-ex-gay organizations. They were gay-affirming websites raising awareness about conversion therapy, but they were not providers. They don't provide not even phone counseling. And the only person that provided some kind of counseling that knew about conversion therapy wanted, get this, hundreds of dollars an hour. That was my reality, and I ended up getting on disability because of my trauma. And I have never gotten my life back. I've never gotten my career back. I had a business in Alaska. I was teaching music, and I had a reputation as a good teacher. People would recommend folks to me. I never got that back. I never did get healed. I have suffered with this for years. I am still incredibly fucked up. And so when I got this email, it was almost, I think it was a year or two ago, from this family member. These were organizations that basically raise money to raise awareness about conversion therapy. And they post stories of survivors. And the irony is that, yes, I not only knew about these websites, of course, I was affiliated with some of this stuff. They mentioned my story in some of this stuff. And here are family members saying, oh, there's plenty of help for you. There is help. There's recovery. Here's these organizations. And I was like, these don't. So what is the purpose of doing an article that basically confirms the fact that conversion therapy is harmful? The American Psychological Association has already said it's harmful. Anybody that has a gay-affirming stance, anybody who's geared towards the left side of religion and politics agree. So we don't need to confirm that it's harmful. What we need to do is we need to raise awareness that there are people that make some phone calls if they are gay and they're religious. And there is so much stuff out there for them to try to turn into heterosexuals, but there is nothing out there that I have found that offers legitimate mental health care for those that are traumatized because of these organizations, and I wish somebody would print that.
And I admit I don't see what's out there in the media as much as I should, because it really depresses me, because it usually is the same stories over and over again. And a lot of times what happens is you get somebody who's featured in a story and they have the same characteristics of what I consider people that are in towards the top of a social hierarchy in the gay community. And so what we're doing without even realizing it is we're taking ex-gay survivors and we are putting them in a social club that is privileged. And what we need to do is we need to feature those that are really suffering and that are still suffering. I'm sorry, this has just been burning in me for so much, and I just can't stand being silent, because I don't know what it is, but I get on disability, and for some reason that discredits me. I don't know my facts, I don't know my figures and stuff like that, but I do know my story. And my story is the one that doesn't get told very much. And what happened after straight camp is I called, a gay hotline. They offered me nothing but just somebody to talk to and say, you're going to be okay and I'm glad you're coming out. I went to a community center and I found that it was a clique that I was not accepted in. And then I found the gay churches were the same thing. And they don't know what to do with people that are heavily traumatized unless they have a lot of social popularity or a big dick or whatever it is that makes somebody have any kind of voice or influence in their world. And it's sad that I considered myself leaving the gay community a couple of years ago because of this.
So what support would you like to see?
Adequate mental health support. That a trained social worker who knows how to deal with trauma and is knowledgeable, because I'm on Medicare and I get the lowest tier of mental health care, and none of them know about conversion therapy. And I come in and I tell them my background. They won't even learn about anything about conversion therapy, so I have to train them. The other thing too I want you to know is that the mental health nonprofits are just as clueless. And the last time I told a mental health worker at one of these nonprofit groups about my trauma, he laughed. So here it is, one of the worst traumatic things in my life, and this guy who has a job working for a mental health a nonprofit, is laughing at my trauma. So either it's funny to him or it makes him so uncomfortable that that's the only thing he can do is laugh. And another thing too is that I was at a meditation center trying to seek help, and of course not getting it, And one of the teachers there at this meditation center was a psychologist, so I asked him for some referrals. I told him I was on Medicare and it's very hard to find a therapist. I told him my background. And so he sent me an intern who was in the LGBT community, so I had that affirming thing. And guess what? I got laughed at. I got laughed at when I mentioned my 5 years in conversion therapy. And I didn't go back to see that person again. So what happened afterwards, yes, was just as important as what happened when I was in a program that treated me with cruelty. And I did not get received with open arms. I was on my own. I had to heal on my own. And I went from one abusive relationship to the other because I didn't know what to do. People didn't know. I mean, people that are considered emotionally healthy didn't want to be around somebody like me. And this has been 12 years of this. Actually 13 years, because I graduated from the straight camp in October of 2005, and I just assumed that I would not only have my life back, but I wouldn't be haunted with my past. And I assume, because of all the activism that I've done over 10 years of activism. I have traveled the country and told my story, and I'm amazed at the number of people who have gotten in my way because of that. And the people who have made it miserable are the ones in the LGBT community, not the ones on the other side. And one of the weird things is that I've engaged with some of these anti-gay therapy people. Another thing that people do not want to mention, especially me living in the buckle of the unchurched belt here with all the lefty progressives in Portland, we not only have a straight camp here that's been here for decades that they don't want to talk about, that has managed to dodge the media all these years, but we also have the next incarnation of Exodus International that's right here in my little suburb that I live in. And I'm sure you heard about what happened with Exodus International 5 and 6 years ago, right? Do you know what they turned into?
Well, tell me about it. Can you send links to Facebook?
Yeah. Do you realize what organization took over when Exodus International shut down?
Talk to me about it.
Nobody knows about it because they've dodged the media. They have a huge web presence. It's called the Restored Hope Network, and you Google it, and they have bombarded the internet with anti-gay rhetoric. And who is speaking out against them? Very few people. It should be the opposite, because the general opinion of most Americans is that conversion therapy is unnecessary and even harmful. Why is it that when you Google an organization like Pure Life Ministries, is the one that I went to, there's one article that pops up years ago that comes up on the first page in a Google search that is against Pure Life Ministries. Everything else, you go page after page, it is in favor of that organization. They have managed to bombard the web, and that's another thing that we have to do, is not only provide care, is that we have to have a web presence, and we have to get more media coverage about the reality. It's not just a few testimonies of people saying conversion therapy is wrong. We have to go beyond that. Another thing we have to do is the legislation banning it for minors is the first step. But our ultimate goal is to ban it for everyone, especially disabled people, because disabled people should be treated as minors. I had a mental disability, and I was told by people who were doing the work of mental health work. I even had a medical doctor that was anti-gay. I've had people that should have known better who were giving me all kinds of resources that were anti-gay stuff. It should not be done for adults, and if so, churches have to be required by law to have all of their participants read and sign legal paperwork saying that I am getting involved in something that is known to be psychologically harmful. It's not just parents and children that need this. If that had been done to me and I knew what I was getting into, I would have made an informed decision. Instead, I had my family nagging at me and freaking out, which is the worst reaction. And then I had the rest of my family who were just saying, oh, okay, Jason, you know, whatever you think, and they were being all passive-aggressive about it. I wish they would have handled things better, but the thing is that my family, being really nice, educated progressives, you know, they didn't know what to do. So it'd be really good to offer training for people on our side of religion and politics to say, this is how we work with people who are considering going into anti-gay forms of therapy or that are already in that. And here's another thing too, is that I thought, since I'm demanding a whole bunch of things from you, I thought I'd take it further. Is that okay? Okay. How about we just say that anything that has psychological harm should be addressed. Any religious organization that does what they call biblical counseling, which has been a trend. It was a trend in the 80s, and then it came back in the last 10, 20 years. Biblical counseling is psychologically harmful, whether it's for straight people or gay people. That would be another wonderful thing, too. I'm demanding a lot of things. My life has been miserable, and the only thing that's kept me going is the fact that I'm following my dream to be a producer and, to do my multimedia art and music is my dream. If I didn't have that, I would resort to violent crime, because typically middle-aged guys that are by themselves with this much trauma and having nowhere to go to deal with it, and every time I go somewhere to try to get help, I typically end up worse or not getting the help I need. This is what happens to middle-aged men when we get alone and we're treated unfairly. Is the only way we prevent ourselves from getting ignored. And that's why I'm so scared of getting ignored. That's why I flipped out on you yesterday, because I felt like I was getting ignored. Most men, when they get ignored, they start collecting firearms, and that's how they feel empowered. Now, here's the thing, is that it's obvious that the 51st victim of the Pulse shooting in Orlando, and I consider him the worst victim of that, because he was a victim of anti-gay theology. He had access to firearms. That was his choice on how he dealt with it. And I think if we put things in perspective, that there are a lot of men who are dealing with this very thing, and if we don't give them the right tools, then they're going to resort to violent crime. This was a gay man who committed that violent crime, right?
Yeah.
And what scared me the most is every time I heard that, they all just talked about 50 victims. Or what was it, 49 that were shot?
Yeah, 49.
Okay, 49 that was shot. Yeah. Okay, so there was actually 50 if you count the shooter, right?
Right.
Because he took, okay, so it's not the 51st victim. The 50th victim was the one that I identified with the most. Because I had nowhere to go, and if I didn't have my art to express myself, who knows what kind of damage I would have done. Yeah, because I was rejected in my faith community, and that was my family, that was my world to me. And they all turned their back on me, but when I went into the gay community and they turned their back on me, where was I to go? It's just luck, I think, that I'm still alive and telling my story. But I still don't think I'm a successful case, because like I said, I've never gotten my life back. I've never gotten my career back. And the more I suffer, the more I lose relationships. And the more I lose opportunities to do business with people. And most of it has to do with the trauma from straight camp and from the other years of going through this stuff, not having access to legitimate help, not having a supportive community. And that's what we need to focus on in addition to legislation. It's going to take a lot of work, especially in rural America, which this is a huge deal in rural America, and we like to focus, as educated progressives, we like to focus on urban Americans.
Oh, right. All right. Well, Jason, thank you very much for sharing your story. And of course, the whole goal of this is to show a wide range of what happens to people, the wide range of people that get affected by this. I think it's very important for you to share what you dealt with.
So, I just gave you probably way more information that they're going to allow you to print in a particular story. Could you tell me, having known this, what do you plan on doing with all this information that I gave you? Because it sounds like this is a lot of new stuff you haven't heard before.
Well, tell you what, because the piece is going to be about 1,500 to 2,000 words. But I'm going to talk to them. I'm going to, rather than just building myself the first interview and see it done, craft something with what you said here and put a lot of focus on this.
Okay, yeah, because basically it sounds like the articles that are out there are just urging people to vote for this. Chances are, if they're liberal progressives, they're going to vote for it anyways. They all know it's harmful. We're basically preaching to the choir. But there's a lot more that people can do to create a safe and welcoming and productive environment for those who have been devastated, whose lives have been ruined by forms of conversion therapy. The ones whose lives have really been ruined, those are the people they don't want to tell their stories. I have urged some people to tell their stories, and they won't.
Well, and I've run into that, Jason. I've run into that. I mean, I'd love to be telling more stories than we're probably going to get to, but thank you for telling yours, because I think it is going to be an important part of this.
Okay.
Right.
Well, I still have a few more things to add. Could you contact me later, and I can review this and see if there's anything else I can add to it. I would love to be a part of a bigger project. I would love it for you if you could ask around your colleagues to see if there's anybody who wants to do some investigative journalism, simply because nobody has, at least nobody in America has made a legitimate investigative project to expose, one, the Restored Hope Network. Another one is the Portland Fellowship, which is ironic to having an ex-gay program in Portland all these years. And the other one is, of course, Pure Life Ministries, who's managed to dodge the media. They have big lawyers. They have big pockets. They have a lot of churches that back them. And so,
that's even in your straight camp, right?
Yeah, that was the camp that I went to. Another one is called Celebrate Recovery. They're a Christian 12-step thing. A lot of times they send gays to those programs because they have sexual addiction programs in them as well, because they believe being gay is a sexual addiction. You've probably heard that before. And there's offshoots of that as well that can be extremely psychologically harmful. And I think it would be great if we were able, because here's the thing, is that we really can't get numbers. We can't get statistics when there's a lot of people out on the fringe who are so fucked up that they won't even be counted. And it's sad that sometimes I'm the only one that they want to talk to. And I hate having these conversations because I tell them, hey, could you talk to somebody else about this? And it's like, no, they don't want to deal with it. They just want to forget about it and take their hard drugs and just pretend like it had never happened.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Jason, thank you.
Okay.
And, I'll make sure to let you know when we're going to run your piece, too. Okay, so as soon as I hear back from that, and, I'm going to revise some things here, but as soon as I hear back and know when they're going to run your piece,
And could I look at the piece before you print it? Do I have a right to do
Yes.
that? Okay.
You know,
Can I add some
I've done that
multimedia
for,
stuff?
somebody else. I don't mind doing that for you,
Okay.
and I'll do that. Okay.
Since a lot of it's going to be online, could I submit some
Yeah.
multimedia stuff to it as well?
I'll talk to my guys about that.
Okay. That's
Okay.
because I don't want to try to upstage anybody, but I have a lot to say, and hopefully it won't end here. Hopefully, some folks in your community will take to heart some of the things that I've addressed here that they typically don't address, and if not, then basically you're part of my story. The fact that people approach me wanting to do stories, that's part of my story. Whatever they don't print is going to be a part of my story that I will print and I will get out there. And if I have a lot of exposure, someone's going to be like, okay, these are the things that Jason really wants to say that this gay paper doesn't want to say, because we're too afraid to see that as the affirming and tolerant people, that we don't affirm certain people and we don't tolerate certain people based on their disabilities and their social status. And they don't want to admit that. So if you run into problems that basically you're running into some heavy issues that the LGBT community does not want to address, and you as a journalist, that would be a great opportunity to say, hey, fuck that. And hey, we need to look at our own problems so we can heal ourselves, so we can move on, and then maybe we can start preaching at anti-gay people.
Right.
But that's it. I will let you get going, and I really appreciate you calling me and spending some more time with me, and I really look forward to hearing back. And if you don't have time, and if you disappear in the middle of a conversation, at least let me know. Oh, can I get back to you on this? That would make me feel less anxious.
Okay, I'll try to do that, Jason.
That's awesome, man. Hey, lots of love to you, and I wish you the best in this thing, man. I really appreciate what you're doing.
All right. Well, hey, thank you, and thank you for your time.
Okay, bye-bye now.